Welcome to the 18th day of our 21-day course on human rights. We are in module 3 today, and we will be dealing with UN special rapporteurs, particularly the special procedures in all the special rapporteurs, the working groups, and the independent experts, as well as attempting to also enter into the universal periodic review that we need to understand. We have with us this morning Professor Steve Marks, who was also there yesterday. We are grateful to him for agreeing to come in for a second session. Welcome to you this morning, Steve. Good morning. And I'll hand over the session to you so that I don't waste 1 minute more of your precious time.
All right. Well, it's a great pleasure to be back. I see that there are about 160 people joining in. It is a pleasure for me to be back with you. Yesterday's session, I hope, complemented what your brilliant leader has already introduced to you. I have seen the presentations that were made, and I'm going to shift now to my presentation. I'm assuming you can see this now. Can you see the presentation? It shows part 2, UPR and special procedures of this overview of human rights mechanisms of the United Nations. Yesterday, we examined, as you had already examined with Henry, the treaty bodies, and I challenge you all to be able to tell your children and grandchildren and impress your friends and everything that I know what the 3 functions of the treaty bodies are. And if you don't remember them from yesterday, here's a recapitulation. The treaty bodies examine the reports from governments that have ratified the treaties and are under a legal obligation to submit the reports. And at the end of those reports, they issue concluding observations that can be very critical of governments, and that's where the role of civil society is important, to provide the information so you get honest, useful concluding observations. The general comments have been, I didn't have an opportunity to say this yesterday, I want to repeat it today, have been absolutely extraordinary in clarifying and expanding the normative content of the human rights treaties. The field in which I work, on the right to health, for example, has been, in a sense, I wouldn't exactly say revolutionized, but almost revolutionized by general comment number 14 that clarified the normative scope of the right to health. What does it mean? How do you implement it, and so on. And the third are the complaints procedures, and there you learned another term for your vocabulary, that at the conclusion of the examination of complaints under optional protocols and declarations of the treaties that allow individuals to submit complaints, the committee renders its final views. That is called final views because they are not judges empowered to act as judges, but they do render judgments on whether or not there's been a violation of the treaty. I didn't say this yesterday, whether or not there's been a violation. And so they're acting like judges. And if there has been a violation, what the government should do about it, to change its laws, to provide compensation, and so on. We saw an example of that using a case that had been just rendered the day before, on the 26th of May in Tajikistan. Many examples, hundreds and thousands of examples, all available on the website. But the final point that I want to make on those final views is to give you another term of vocabulary that you can use to show off to your friends and to impress people when you engage with the international system. And that is that these bodies that are independent experts, not judges, are rendering their final views that look like judgments in a court of law. So we have a term for that. We use a Latin term. We call them quasi-judicial decisions. We can't call them judicial because they're not judges. They don't wear robes and wigs or whatever else you want to use to identify and clarify who is a judge and who is not a judge. But they look like judges, so we call them quasi-judicial procedures. Now, so that's what I wanted to say about reviewing what we had yesterday, and perhaps, I don't know if you want to take any leftover questions from yesterday. Let me first introduce what I plan to do for today. You've already examined the Universal Periodic Review. So I'm going to review the UPR and give you the example of the outcome of the third cycle of the UPR for India in very concrete terms, and then move on to the subject that was announced as my main subject, which is the UPR. Putting this all into context, yesterday, here's civil society interaction. That's what you're primarily interested in. And civil society can engage across the full range of mechanisms of the United Nations. And we're only talking about a few of them here. Yesterday, we talked about the treaty bodies and a little bit about the Human Rights Council. NGOs can be present at the Human Rights Council. We did not talk about field offices, but NGOs, of course, can interact with the staff of the UN in the field offices. And I did mention that the staff often cooperate with UN peacekeeping operations and OCHA, the Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. Today, as you can see, we're going to be examining civil society interactions with the UPR and with the special procedures. So that sets the context. And here's another overview of the context we looked at of the human rights procedures that you are becoming familiar with. The 10 treaty bodies, the UPR we're looking at today, the special procedures we're looking at today, and the functioning of the Secretariat. We divided these yesterday between charter-based and treaty-based bodies. And so we can get right into the UPR and primarily be asking ourselves the question, does civil society have any role to play in this function? Now, you've already had an overview by Henry on the functioning of the UPR. What I'm going to do is present a lot of the same information with a little bit of a different focus and conclude with the actual outcome of the third cycle concerning India. Here's what you need to do. This is a historical overview of the UPR since 2006 when it was created. One of the things you need to keep in mind, since I have set this course, or my contribution to this course, in the context of the balancing of law and politics, the ideals of the UN taking action for effective realization of human rights on the one hand, and governments reaffirming their sovereignty and rejecting influences by either civil society organizations or the United Nations in their work. That struggle, that balancing act, is essential to understanding what are the procedures, UN procedures for human rights, and the potential for their actually having an impact on people's lives. In 2006, there was a major reform in the UN, and many countries were frustrated with the way the Commission on Human Rights had been functioning. And one of their frustrations, among many, was to say that the UN had become very selective. The UN would gang up on certain countries and not on others. And this angered many states that participated in the reform. There were many political influences on this reform. But the principal outcome in addressing the issue of selectivity in what countries would be examined as violators of human rights was to come up with a mechanism that was not envisaged by the Charter, that the member states never thought would be possible in the 1940s, 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, and so on, never thought would be possible, which was to allow the treaty bodies to continue to examine the reports coming from states parties with input from civil society on the treaty obligations of those treaties. All right, that you expect, you ratify the treaty, you expect to be held to it. But what about the countries that haven't ratified the treaty or that have finished their cycle of reporting and nothing is happening? To overcome the selectivity, and of course, when there's a special denunciation of a country for its violations of human rights, that only exists because of the political will in the Commission on Human Rights to choose a country and adopt a resolution condemning it for violations. The way around this was to come up with a universal periodic review. That is, periodically, for every country to be examined. And that was the rationale behind, the political rationale behind the creation in 2006 of the UPR. When it started, however, and I was there at the sessions, I don't know if you were, Henry, but I attended those first sessions, were extremely disappointing. A government would present its report and its friends would raise their hands and be the next speakers afterwards and say, we wish to compliment the government of Belarus for its outstanding report. And then they go on to the next one, another friend of Belarus or of the United Kingdom, and compliment them on their excellent report. And then 5 countries would do that. And the president of the Human Rights Council, which it had become by then, would say, okay, we're out of time, we're moving on to the next country. End of periodic review. Waste of time. This was a disappointing start because governments lined up friendly countries to speak kind words about their reports, and nothing, we didn't go beyond that. This was reviewed, new procedures were established. The council became much more open to hearing to taking seriously the 3 sources of information, not just the government report, but the report from the UN treaty bodies and other special procedures and what they had done in relation to that specific country, and other stakeholders, including NGOs and national human rights institutions. And then countries, sometimes friendly countries to the country being reviewed, but in many cases, other countries would utilize this opportunity not just to score a political point. Yes, when India is being considered, Pakistan is going to have something to say about Kashmir. So no surprises there, right? But the surprises come when you have countries that you wouldn't expect to be, for example, deeply concerned about gun violence in the United States. And they'll make a big issue about that. Deeply concerned, you know, and you wouldn't, they have no particular political rationale for doing so. So you end up getting an extremely diverse range of critical observations of the reports submitted by the government under the Universal Periodic Review. And the recommendations that emerge from the consideration of the country reviews are more and more considered by the leadership of the Human Rights Council to be genuinely a source of change. Governments are going to be held to account. We're going to review them afterwards. We're going to look at their recommendations, say, which ones do you accept? Which ones you're going to work on? Which ones do you reject? And we're going to come back to these later and so on. So it's come from being a very wishy-washy sort of procedure to a much more rigorous procedure. And failure to implement the recommendations made during the first review is taken up during the second review. And if necessary, the council may address cases where states are not cooperating. And as you'll see in the example that I will give in a moment, these recommendations can be very penetrating and direct. I think you've had this information already, but what I want to draw your attention to is the way you can access very complete information on the Universal Periodic Review. There is an official source, which is OHCHR, and there is an NGO source, which is UPR Info. And I can click here right now and show it to you, but I urge you to do this. This is the way you can find out what are the official documents and reports concerning any country under the Universal Periodic Review. The cycles, the sessions, the documentation by country, the midterm information, etc. This is the official source of documentation on the UPR that is managed by the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. And our friend Milun Kotari established an organization, a non-governmental organization called UPR Info, in which the information is compiled in a different way that is useful to civil society organizations. So I strongly urge you to use that source of information. Now, here is a way, well, let me give you an example. If we have a minute, I'm going to give you now a very brief presentation by UPR Info. You didn't show this film, did you, Henry? UPR Info's
No, we had a film of our own, which is there,
okay.
which are going to send the participants after the program is over.
The Universal Periodic Review is a unique mechanism of the United Nations. This mechanism aims at improving the human rights situation in each of the 193 UN member states. The UPR is a 5-year cycle process comprised of 3 key stages. First, the review in Geneva of the human rights situation in the state.
Can you hear it?
Review.
No,
Second,
little more.
Implementation between 2 reviews.
Little more.
Recommendations made.
Wait, let me stop it. Can you hear it?
Now it is
More
stopped.
volume?
More volume, yes.
Okay, sorry about that.
The state under review. Third, the assessment at the next review of the implementation of those recommendations and the developments of the human rights situation in the country since the previous review. 3 main documents underpin each review. A national report written by the state under review. In this context, the state is encouraged to conduct national consultations with national civil society in order to reflect their concerns and to comprehensively assess the domestic human rights situation. A compilation by the Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights of information from treaty bodies, special procedures, and UN agencies. A summary drafted by the OHCHR based on the information received from national institutions and CIS. The review in Geneva consists of 3 steps. First, the state is reviewed during 3.5 hours by a working group comprising all UN member and observer states. These states make recommendations on how to improve the human rights situation in the state under review. This exercise results in a draft report containing, on average, 200 recommendations. Second, the draft report is adopted by the working group a few days after the review. Third, the draft report is formally adopted at the Human Rights Council a few months later. At this stage, the state under review must declare which recommendations are supported and which are noted. The UPR is a truly universal process as it reviews all UN member states and takes into consideration all human rights, from civil and political rights to economic, social, and cultural rights, regardless of the size or human rights situation in a given state. At the UPR, states are reviewed by states. Nonetheless, civil society, national institutions, the media, and the citizens have a great role to play. They can provide information before the review of the states and assess and support the implementation of recommendations.
Okay, so that's an overview of the process prepared by UPR Info. Let's take a quick look at the example of India. Yeah, have you done this already? Yes, Henry.
Can I just show them one page from the WGHR website?
Sure, I'm going to show them the India report in a minute.
No, the WGHR website
Oh, okay.
page. 1 minute.
That's what this is. This is from the OHCHR website.
This is from the
WGHR, I see.
This is from the WGHR website. It
Good.
shows the process that was taking place, and the participants may be able to identify some of the resource persons who came, who are all here. Not this one, but Milun Kotari is there, Shivani is here,
Yes.
and then you see Ruth there. Most of the people you saw are all here. In the preparation to the third report that you are talking about, this was the preparatory process. Here is Maya Darwala. Here is Vrinda Grover, whom you will see seeing soon. Father Stan is talking here. Father Stan Swami. Okay. And below that, you will see the UPR3. This is the report of civil society first. This is the report of civil society. I don't know whether you're able to see it.
Yes.
Then you have the UPR recommendations by the governments that Steve was talking about. We have compiled it together. We had prepared fact sheets earlier when the lobbying for these recommendations took place. And then, of course, you have the midterm report from 2015. We are preparing the midterm report now. So this is the timeline. And these are our fact sheets which you can access. You can all access the fact sheets straight away. We are going to give you this. I mean, this is in the WGHR website, but we will also give you all the fact sheets. And this will show you what is the UPR.
What is the Universal Periodic Review, or the UPR? A unique mechanism of the United Nations Human Rights Council, which involves a country-wide review of the human rights situation of 193 UN member states every 5 years. 42 states are reviewed each year. The results of review are made into an outcome report with recommendations and observations made to improve the human rights situation. The country is expected to adopt and implement changes before the next review cycle. What makes the UPR a unique process? Equality, participation and contribution by all citizens like you, creating a network between you, the government, and national human rights institutions. Let's understand the UPR in 4 stages. The preparation. 3 main documents used to conduct the review on human rights in the country. All reports are submitted to UN High Commissioner for Human Rights by the last date on the website. Presenting. Presenting a report on the status of human rights along with various measures taken to promote and protect your rights since the previous UPR. The country highlights the growth progress implemented in the past years. During India's review, 112 countries made 250 recommendations asking India to adopt a national plan on human rights, ratify the UN Convention Against Torture, increase public spending in the health sector, take futuristic steps to curb acts like honor killings and marital rape, repeal sections 377 to protect the rights of sexual minorities, human rights training of police officials, ensure access to adequate housing, water, and sanitation. Adopting and acting on specific recommendations, the ones the country will be implementing during the next review period. On the 21st of September 2017, India presents the recommendations it is willing to accept in the next 5 years. The implementation. The implementation of the recommendations is evaluated through a voluntary midterm review process in the HRC. Looking ahead, India's UPR for 2017 will end on 21st of September. India must now deliver, and we, as responsible citizens and civil society actors, must play our part to ensure that the country keeps its word. Some ways you can help. Monitor recommendations made in UPR. Join the community in creating a situation for the government to realize the importance of the recommendations accepted and noted. Be an advocate for change. Need help? Look up the UN Substantial Development website, which looks like this. Provide credible and consistent information about the situation on the ground to international human rights bodies. We can and we must. We are the people. We are sovereign. We are the guardians of our constitution. Satyamev Jayate.
Sorry, Steve. It is there.
Really good. Okay. So that was excellent. So when you go to the website of the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, you get access to the documentation presented like this. And if you look at the key outcome document, which is the report of the working group, in the case of the third cycle of India that came out in July 2017, it's a long document. It begins by reiterating what you've learned now in 5 different ways in which we've presented it, is that the input is these 3 documents: the national report, OHCHR compilation, and civil society and National Human Rights Institute's report. So that's paragraph 3 of the document. When you get to paragraph 161, called Conclusions and or Recommendations, it says the following recommendations will be examined by India, which will provide responses in due time, but no later than the 36th session of the Council. As was mentioned in the film, there are 250 recommendations. Recommendation 1 was from Estonia. It said, ratify the second optional protocol to the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. All the way to paragraph 161.250, which is to provide unhindered access of the UN to Kashmir.
Professor, sorry to interrupt. We are not able to see your screen. Can you share it?
Sorry?
We are not able to see your screen. Can you?
Oh, you can't see it? Oh my
Yeah.
goodness, I've been showing this all the time. You can't see the screen. You should have told me sooner. I didn't, because I had it up and I thought that's what I was looking at. Oh my goodness. Yes, please catch.
I am sorry. I should apologize. I occupied your screen.
Okay, can you see this now?
Yes, it's visible
Yes.
now.
Okay. All right, quickly, this is what I was referring to. When you go to the OHCHR website, and you can click this link to get there, you find this on any country, according to the cycle, where you get these official documents. They're extremely useful. And when you go to the national report here and look at the, excuse me, not the national report, but the outcome, down here at the bottom, the report of the working group, you click the English version here, this is what you get. This is what the document looks like, the official document. And it reiterates at the beginning, as I was saying a moment ago, the 3 sources of information that's used. That's the formal presentation. You've seen in the 2 films that we saw, the informal way of showing these 3 inputs. Here's the formal way of showing it. These are the 3 documents that are examined. And when you get to the end of the report, it says conclusions and recommendations. And as was pointed out, 250 recommendations in the case of the third cycle of India. The first one is to ratify the second optional protocol, and the 250th one is one of several proposed by Pakistan relating to Kashmir. In between, you have, and you saw that in the film, that excellent film that Henry just presented, other examples of the many, many very concrete situations that were reflected in the conclusions and recommendations of the report, in large part as the result of the excellent work that you have done to draw attention to that. And in this case, you can see the changes in the second periodic review of India. There were 169 recommendations, and in this one there were 250 recommendations. Then the game becomes after that to keep after the government, to keep watching, to keep interacting with the government, either in a cooperative mode, when you can deal with the ministry and helping organizing training programs for police and things like that, or a more confrontational mode when the government is not being cooperative and you need to go to the media and you need to issue reports, you need to mobilize people. So the UPR constitutes a rather extraordinary tool for both assessing government behavior and holding governments accountable and maintaining the pressure on them. So since we've had now numerous presentations on the UPR, I'd better stop for any questions on this topic before I move on to the final subject, which is the special procedures. Any questions on the UPR?
No questions on the UPR as of now. Maybe you can
Okay.
continue then.
Very good. Now, the history of the special procedures.
Steve,
Yes,
shall I just add a word
please.
for people to understand that in India we made the UPR come closer to each one of us. We had, at the time when the government of India was being heard and was making its presentation on the floor of the Human Rights Council, we had 45 video sessions organized across the country, where people in India were watching our representatives make their official statements in Geneva. This was a 2.5-hour session, but watched and in some places translated. In Rajasthan, it was translated into Rajasthani. It was held in Tirunelveli. It was held in Madurai. In Tamil Nadu alone, it was held in about 20 places and the rest in different places. It was fantastic watching the scene. And I want to narrate that there was a professor in Tirunelveli who happened to be a student of JNU, who was translating the program in Tirunelveli when he saw his classmate as part of the Indian delegation bluffing there. So he called him on the mobile phone, on the WhatsApp, and said, "What the hell are you doing? The whole country is watching here." And he said, "What are you watching? This is not to be watched here." He says, and he used their own JNU language very casually and said, "This is what you are doing, you fellows there. And the entire country is watching. And I am translating whatever nonsense you are saying there." That was the effect. And later, when the plenary session took place, my dear friends, we had almost 400 sessions across the country. 400 places people were watching what India was doing in Geneva. So we have to make measures very simple for Geneva to come close to our premises. It has to come very, very close. The Indian Social Institute was the venue for the first program where we had 300 people watching it. So it is just to say, let's not think this is in Geneva. We can all bring Geneva here. And this Indian experience was the unique globally, which we did through the WGHR when I happened to be the convener of the WGHR at that time. Thank you. Thank you.
Wow. That is spectacular. That is transparency. That is mobilization at its best. I'm honored to be informed about this, and I hope all of the participants, many of whom I guess participated in that, will translate this into other similar actions on other procedures. Now, another mechanism that also was not anticipated back in the days when I was showing you the efforts of the United Nations to balance Article 2.7 of the UN Charter that says states the UN cannot intervene in matters that are within the domestic jurisdiction of states, with Articles 55 and 56 when they pledge to take joint and separate action in cooperation with the organization to advance human rights. At that time, there was no expectation that any countries would be mentioned by name. There was no expectation that there would be official procedures that would allow independent individuals to tell truth to power, as it were, to borrow that overused expression. It was expected that the UN would be promoting human rights by talking in general about the administration of justice is important. Let's agree that that needs to be improved. Racial discrimination is an important issue. At that time, there was no expectation that anybody would talk about even South Africa. And when South Africa was talked about, it was first only talked about in relation to the people of Indian origin in South Africa, not the majority black population of South Africa. And that was the first time that any country was mentioned by name. We've come a long way since then. And the special procedures emerged when there was a confrontation. It's a very interesting story. A political confrontation related to the Cold War and the influence of the Soviet Union in Chile and Argentina. In the case of Chile, the Commission on Human Rights was willing to mention violations of human rights because the Soviet Union was in favor of publicly discussing violations of human rights in Chile because of their defense of the Communist Party in Chile, and there was a political will to do so, and the rest of the world was listening. Chile could be mentioned. Argentina could not during the time of the dictatorship in Argentina. Why not? It could not because, this is an oversimplification, the history tells a more subtle story of it, but in one reason, because Argentina sold beef to Russia, and Russia defended the dictatorial military regime in Argentina, and Argentina would not be mentioned by name. We mobilized to try to find a way out of this. One of the ways out was to say, all right, look, what's going on in Argentina that is really bothering us is the forced disappearances of persons. All these people, all these leftist politicians are being rounded up, tortured, held incommunicado, taken up on airplanes and dumped into the sea. This is inexcusable. And there was a political will to say, okay, if that's the problem, that there are forced disappearances, Argentina is not the only place where that's happening. You can study that. And a working group was established to study that question, not to study Argentina, but to study that question. And in the analysis, looking at the situation in various countries, of course, Argentina was mentioned, but it was not Argentina specific. That opened the door to the Commission on Human Rights, examining, in this case, what we now call a thematic issue. Couldn't discuss Argentina itself because the political will was not there due to Cold War issues. But the problem of forced disappearances could be studied. That was the beginning of the opening of the door to creating what became special procedures. That if the political will was there, that subject could be studied. Torture could be studied. Gender discrimination could be studied in various ways. Violence against women could be studied. Different issues could be studied. And then little by little, the willingness emerged to say, if we can do this on thematic issues, we can also do it the way we did for Chile on country-specific issues. So there emerged a willingness to designate either a small group of people, called a working group, or an independent expert, or the more common term, a special rapporteur, to examine burning issues and report back to the Council and to the General Assembly of the United Nations on the nature of the problem, the extent of the problem, and what should be done about it. This has evolved a lot over time. Today, there are 44 thematic mandates covering disabilities and education and sustainable development and food and opinion and expression and hazardous substances and waste and indigenous peoples and health and all of these issues, 44 of them. But there have also been up to 20 country mandates. Today, there are 12 country mandates covering countries like Cambodia and the Central African Republic and Eritrea and Iran and Haiti and the Palestinian occupied territories, Syria, of course, and so on. So these emerged from the hypocrisy of the UN willing to talk only in the abstract about human rights issues, and the pressure that was brought to bear and the emergence of a political will to talk more explicitly about what's really going on in countries and to designate people to go to those places, to examine those situations, to look at the problem of education, of disabilities, of hazardous substances, and so on. in very explicit ways. And many of these thematic mandates have deeply influenced the emergence of general comments that you're very familiar with. So I'll give you one example of that. There is, it's a very current example that illustrates this process of how the thematic mandates allow an independent individual to investigate a problem that not only helps governments and civil society organizations understand the depth of that problem by looking at the real situation affecting countries, but it also can affect the treaty bodies. And in the case of the Special Rapporteur on the right to culture, on cultural rights, she examined cultural rights under Article 13 of the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. And by interacting with different organizations, some of which I've been involved with, was convinced to take up the issue of a very neglected right in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, namely the right of everyone to benefit from advances in science and technology. And she did a report on that and recommended that the Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights take this up to examine it for a potential general comment. Guess what? A few weeks ago, the committee adopted a general recommendation on the right to science, a direct result of a thematic mandate that recommended it. So those are the essence of the thematic mandates. When you have either a country mandate or a thematic mandate, the mandate holders, as I said, special rapporteurs, independent experts, or working groups, can conduct country visits. They issue, most of their work is to issue thematic and country reports that are submitted to the Human Rights Council and the United Nations General Assembly, and they can receive complaints. Now, I noticed in your PowerPoint presentation, Henry, you also presented this information that in the reform of 2007, when the Human Rights Council said, we created new procedures, we created the council in 2006, we created the Universal Periodic Review, we have these mandates, we need to do a better job. This is sloppy. And one of the things they had learned from those special mandates, the country reports and the thematic reports, is that extraordinary individuals were selected to carry out these mandates, and they prove the value of having independent people with genuine expertise who do not take instructions from governments. And they codified this in a resolution. And so these terms that you put up on your slide, Henry, are directly taken from a resolution of the council in which they said, in appointing mandate holders, special rapporteurs, and so on, paramount importance will be given to expertise in the field of the mandate, independence, impartiality, personal integrity, and objectivity. Guess what? And I think Henry will agree with me. It has been absolutely extraordinary the extent to which all of these criteria have been met by most mandate holders. There are some of the most extraordinary individuals, some of our good friends who have done this. Look at the example that we all know from his role in the UPR, Milun Kotari, who's special rapporteur on housing and evictions, and the current special rapporteur on that topic, who was just appointed a few weeks ago at the beginning of this month, is Balakrishnan Rajagopal, another Indian origin professor at MIT and close friend, who also exemplifies these characteristics. Nobody expected in the 50s, 60s, and 70s in the UN that this would be the accurate description of most of the mandate holders. Here's a very recent example, just again, a month ago. The Special Rapporteur on the promotion and protection of the right to freedom of opinion and expression, This one happens to be an American professor. An American professor, oh, this must be somebody supporting Trump, right? Guess what? David Kay is a very independent scholar who has examined the very difficult issue of relating his mandate to the current pandemic. And he identified 5 areas in which the question of freedom of expression needs to be addressed in the context of pandemics such as COVID-19. Access to information, access to the internet, protection and promotion of independent media, public health, disinformation is a problem, and public health surveillance. Obviously, if you look at the newspaper today, you can see the intense relevance of what he had to say. And it's worth reading his concluding paragraph. In a nutshell, the premise underlying freedom of opinion and expression strongly supports appropriate public health responses to COVID. So don't think that freedom of expression means that you can bypass public health necessities and emergencies. Freedom to share information and ideas empowers individuals and communities, human development and democratic self-governance. In certain circumstances, information saves lives. By contrast, lies and propaganda deprive individuals of autonomy, of the capacity to think critically, of trust in themselves and in sources of information, and the right to engage in the kind of debate that improves social conditions. Worst of all, censorship can kill by design or negligence, and that's the censorship relating to access to the information concerning coronavirus. You can take the full range of thematic rapporteurs and country rapporteurs and find similar efforts to this. One of the most extraordinary ones is another good friend of ours, Philip Alston, who is the special rapporteur on a number of issues, but most recently, he stepped down from it now, on extreme poverty. And with that mandate, he went to Haiti during the cholera epidemic there. And he said something that nobody else was willing to say. He said, not only has this cholera epidemic occurred while the United Nations deployed peacekeeping operations here in Haiti, he said, the United Nations is criminally responsible. You don't do that if you're representing the United Nations unless you have complete independence to call it the way you see it. And Philip called it the way he sees it. Billy's one of the more outspoken ones. Now, he might be, Philip Alston might be at one end of a spectrum of people. If you look at David Kay here is saying some reasonable things that are critical of government practice. Philip Alston is saying the UN is criminally responsible and owes compensation to the victims of cholera in Haiti. He also went to the World Bank and he said, I'm at the World Bank. This is the human rights free zone. They occasionally talk about human rights, but they engage in policies and practices that are harmful to human rights. So that's part of what you need to understand of the way in which these special procedures function. The same thing can be said of country mandates. Here is a country mandate in Iran, and the mandate holder happens to be Javid Rahman. He's the third special rapporteur on this topic, and his mandate was renewed in March 2018. They extended the mandate and appointed him to it. He has, this is just to give you an example of the range of people, because if I'm talking about Philip Alston and David Kay, of course, the woman who is in charge of the mandate on cultural rights is from a developing country. I think she's, I forget, she's Sri Lankan, I can't remember. Anyway, these people come from all over the world. They come from different backgrounds, but they have expertise, and they do both thematic and country reporting. The third function of, and I'm going to conclude with this, of the special procedures is to receive communications. you can, and civil society organizations can send a letter concerning a state, lay out the facts, refer to the human rights standards, and call upon the special rapporteur to intervene. And the special rapporteur sends very directly worded letters to government saying, it has been brought to my attention that you are either under my thematic mandate failing to give adequate attention to the following problems, or under my country mandate that you're committing violations to these individuals. Kindly report back to me on what you're doing about it, and I'm going to keep track of this. So that's the third function of the special communications. And to conclude, there is a universal human rights index database that you can access easily via the website of the High Commissioner for Human Rights that will give you the specific information on all of the reports, all of the accusations, all of the communications from the treaty bodies, the special procedures, and the UPR. So the information is readily available to organizations and NGOs and so on. And I know that we don't have much time today, so those are my reflections on where the special procedures come from and the input that civil society can have in influencing thematic and country mandates. Of course, one of the things I didn't say is when the special procedure visits a country, either to examine a thematic issue or human rights violations in that country, he or she looks for opportunities to interact with civil society, wants to meet not only with the national human rights institutions, but also with civil society organizations and individuals, and of course with the government. But they're very open to that. So when there's a mandate on an issue that you're concerned with, civil society organizations should work behind the scenes to convince the mandate holder to make a visit to the country, and when the person comes to the country, show the person around, show the person where the problems are, and take them where they want to go. And I'm sure Henry's had many experience with special rapporteurs on that sort of issue. So those are my observations on the three functions of the special procedures. And I'm sure I've gone over time and will welcome your questions. Thank you.
Rajavel?
That's it.
Yes. So there are a couple of questions. One is regarding your Argentinian example. The participants asked whether there has been any resolution work done in the context of India, especially regarding enforced disappearances in the states of Jammu and Kashmir and also Punjab.
This is, of course, this is a very complex case with a very complex history. And I'm sure Henry can give you much more information than I can. Let me give you some impressions of what's been happening since the actions taken by the Indian government to change the constitution and the status of Jammu and Kashmir. I think, in fact, this one of the reasons I welcome this question is that it gives me an example to share with you a practice that has emerged among the special procedures. They have, when critical issues arise, developed the practice of joining together and having 5, 7, 9, 12 mandate holders issue a statement regarding a given issue or problem. And in the case of Jammu and Kashmir, with the alleged torture, arbitrary arrests, suspension of access to the internet, and other practices, all the relevant special rapporteurs, I think there were 9 of them, you can correct me if I'm wrong on this, I'm doing this from memory, special procedures.
6 of them. Six of them. I've got the statement.
You've got the statement. Okay. So and then at the same time, I want to add that the High Commissioner for Human Rights also jumps in and says something about that. So on this particular case, let me turn it over to Henry to discuss the statement, which I don't have with me now, that was issued by 6 special procedures.
Friends, this is the joint statement. Are you able to see it?
Yes.
Titled UN experts urge, sorry. Rajvel, is this okay?
Yes.
Rajvel, is this okay?
Yes, it's visible.
UN rights experts urge India to end communication shutdown in Kashmir. And this was on 22nd of August 2019. And what we need to appreciate here is, on 22nd of August 2019, the Supreme Court had a big lock on its mouth. It did not open its mouth. But the UN special rapporteurs did make a statement. And they say, as I point out here, the experts expressed concern that measures imposed after Indian Parliament revoked the constitutionally mandated status of Jammu and Kashmir would exacerbate tensions in the region. And they go on, the shutdown of internet and telecommunication network without justification from the government are inconsistent with the fundamental norms of necessity and proportionality. All this was said later, several months later by the Supreme Court, but it was said immediately. And those who said it are here. David Kay, who was shown just now by Professor Mark, Special Rapporteur on Promotion and Protection of the Right to Freedom of Opinion and Expression. Michael Frost, who has just completed his term, Special Rapporteur on Situation of Human Rights Defenders. Bernard Duhamel, Chairperson of the Working Group on Enforced Involuntary Disappearances. Clément Boulet, Special Rapporteur on the Right to Peaceful Assembly and Association, who's taken over from our good friend Mainakia, as I mentioned the earlier day. Agnes Kalamar, Special Rapporteur on Extrajudicial Summary and Arbitrary Executions. So this is what happened. I mean, the dates are important, and the fact that a joint statement was made is important. I hand it back to you, Professor.
Not surprisingly, as you recall, the Indian government denounced that, not only the statement by the 6 special procedures, but also the statement by the High Commissioner for Human Rights, and in fact, the Secretary General, and said, this is an internal matter. You have no business discussing this. So this takes us right back to the starting point. In fact, I think if I'm really clever, I can take you right there. Where we started on this, right here. The Indian government says this is a matter exclusively within the domestic jurisdiction of India. It is an internal matter. You cannot say anything about it. We are operating on the principle of Article 2.1. Oh, sorry. Can you see this?
No, we can't see. We can't see.
Oh my goodness. Okay, I'm sorry. I thought that, let me go back to share screen. See, I'm getting used to this little by little, right? Okay, this is what I showed you yesterday. The situation of the special mandates, the Secretary General, the High Commissioner speaking out on the situation in Jammu and Kashmir led the Indian government to formally state this is an internal matter, and that's the position they take in the Security Council as well. This is an internal matter, no business to the UN. Takes us right back to our starting point for our whole discussion about UN procedures, is the balancing of the principle of domestic jurisdiction with the principle of international concern. In this case, India is relying on Article 2.1 and Article 2.7 of the UN Charter on the principle of the UN has no business interfering in matters that were within the domestic jurisdiction of any state. At the same time, what India is avoiding is its pledge under Articles 55 and 56 to take joint and separate action in cooperation with the United Nations for the promotion and protection of human rights. So if the special procedures say, with all of our expertise and our focus on these countries, and the High Commissioner with his sense of responsibility for human rights throughout the UN system, and the Secretary General with the highest political responsibility, all say this is a matter of international concern, India is illustrating the problem that arose from the very beginning of this ambiguous visions of sovereignty, human rights, and the United Nations. Obviously, even if you agree that it is in the long-term interest, and you can see how I'm walking on eggs here, that it may be, as many people in India believe, in the long-term interest of the people of Kashmir, that it ceased to have the autonomy that was in the Constitution, that it become a union territory and so on, and that measures have to be taken that in the long term will be the interest of the Kashmiri people. It is nevertheless an illustration of the problem of the role of the United Nations in dealing with delicate issues affecting human rights within any country, that the international concern with it, the concern of these 6 special procedures should be regarded by the government as saying, yes, it is legitimate that you raise these concerns. Let's try to help you understand why this is in the long-term interest of the Kashmiri people. India didn't do that. India said, Article 2.1, Article 2.7, get out of here, none of your business. So I think that's a very good example of the core problem that is has evolved enormously since 1945, but it's still the same problem. State sovereignty versus international concern, domestic jurisdiction versus UN action. And of course, Jammu and Kashmir in particular is a very clear illustration of the perennial nature of this problem. Other questions?
Thank you, Professor. Yeah. There's one question with regards to Human Rights Council. What's your opinion where member states which have a record of gross human rights violations get elected to the council?
Very good question. Very insightful question. The balancing act that occurs here is between the expectation that has been put into UN resolutions that countries will be elected by the General Assembly to become members of the Human Rights Council on the basis of their willingness to cooperate for the advancement of human rights and their own records on human rights. That is easy to announce. Balance that with the process of selection in which regional politics intervene. And each of the regions of the UN, the geographical regions of the UN, get together and say, well, it's time for the Asia Pacific region or the Western European and others region, or Latin America and the Caribbean. There will be one space opening for us. We need to decide which country is going to go forward. So the politics of that region can interfere. And there may be reasons why a particular country without a particularly stellar record for human rights gets elected. This was a pretext that was used by the United States when it withdrew from the Human Rights Council. The United States government under Trump withdrew from the Human Rights Council, pretexting that the Human Rights Council was, first of all, was selective in its treatment of countries by adopting too many resolutions condemning Israel for violations of human rights in the Palestinian occupied territories on the one hand, and the presence on the Council of gross human rights violators on the other. What is interesting to note, however, is that the final decision, this has been threatened for about a year, the final decision to do so came hours after the High Commissioner for Human Rights, in a statement that I alluded to yesterday, issued a denunciation of the violation of the rights of the child by the way the United States was treating the separation of children from their families on the southern border. So the US used that pretext to leave the council. It is true that some countries that are responsible for massive violations of human rights are members of the council and have been members of the council. That is the result of the complex politics of the regional selection process. It is not effective in excluding countries, but it is one of the criteria for the selection of countries. And I'll say one other thing on this, and I can say this with a certain amount of emotion, having been through situations where I've observed this up close. Sometimes countries that have a bad reputation for human rights are represented by people who are the diplomatic representatives of their country. They take their instructions from their capitals. Find that their engagement with the process is, in the words of one of the diplomats that I interacted with, one of the most humanizing influences on their lives and professional careers. In other words, if a country has human rights violations, when the United States was a member of the Human Rights Council, it was responsible for massive violations of human rights in Iraq and Afghanistan and Guantanamo and many other places with respect to Native American populations in the United States, with respect to minorities in the United States, and so on. Nevertheless, the pressure of being part of the process, being aware that the rest of the world is looking at you, that the rest of the world has different expectations about how you should behave. In the case of India, it's the same thing. India's role in Kashmir, India's role with regard to Dalits and so on. India is has very clever diplomats who will talk about domestic jurisdiction and these are an internal matter and so on. But they're still listening. They're still aware that the expectations of the rest of the world are to move towards universal respect for and observance of human rights and fundamental freedoms for all without distinction as to race, sex, language, or religion. And they know that they've made a legally binding pledge in the UN Charter to work in that direction. So it's also part of that tension. A massive violator of human rights, yes, the North Korea is not going to be elected to the Human Rights Council. But Libya is elected to the Human Rights Council, Iran is elected to the Human Rights Council, the US is elected to the Human Rights Council, and so on. So notwithstanding the fact that one of the criteria for selection is that the country be, in general, respectful of human rights. So it's a complex question. And my personal view is that I see an advantage of countries participating, even though a lot of improvements can be made in their own human rights records.
Raj?
Yes.
Professor, with your permission, I just have a tweet to show the participants. And the tweet comes from the UN Special Rapporteur on Right to Housing, Mr. Balakrishnan Rajagopal, whom you mentioned just now. I also made a mention yesterday. He's of Indian origin, he's from Tamil Nadu. His tweet just now is, I will dedicate my first report to the General Assembly in October 2020 to COVID-19 and the right to housing. You can send in your inputs before 19th June 2020. For all details, please see this thread. And the thread continues. You can contribute in two ways. There is a longer questionnaire developed by a number of UN special procedure experts, mandate holders, who will also dedicate their reports to COVID-19 and human rights. It is available in 3 languages. You can also respond to an online form which contains only specific questions related to my mandate. The deadline for both is 19th June 2020. Thank you in advance for your contributions. Now, here is something which is just coming in, and I thought it is important that participants know how good special rapporteurs, I don't know whether I should use this word, good special rapporteurs engage with civil society, engage with experts outside to contribute to their report, and their reports are actually the compilation of what the world thinks of and contributes towards him. So I think it is important to know that these are not some people sitting somewhere, but these are academics. And for the large group of academics gathered here, here is an academic who is a regular professor in a university who is doing this as an additional responsibility and then taking on a very relevant theme. You saw Shivani talking to us. I'm sure Shivani is going to take the lead. I've just retweeted also on the subject. So this is just to show how relevant all these people are. And for you to be relevant, how every minute you have to go on. You saw Professor Steve, he was bringing out documents of 20th May, 21st May, 25th May. And today we are coming out with a tweet of this morning. Good. Sorry, Professor.
Thank you. I'm not surprised that Raj has sent that around. I've been in touch with him almost daily for the last few months. Full disclosure, he and I are co-editing a book on human rights and development that we're trying to finish. And of course, his mandate is slowing us down a bit, but the ultimate impact will be extremely important. And of course, his interest in engaging genuinely with civil society and having inputs that will be used in his first report is an appeal that I hope many people participating in this program will be able to contribute to. And he's one example of, among many that I was giving you. It is true, let's be honest about this, that those criteria that we saw of expertise and impartiality and so on have sometimes favored people who tend to be predictably critical of governments. I'll give you one example of the politics of this. The first special rapporteur on the right to food was a Swiss individual, professor at the Institute of Development Studies in Geneva, a Swiss gentleman who happens to be, as many academics are, very far to the left, and sees the problem of food as being in part an issue for which a degree of responsibility resides with the big food industry and so on. And when his name was proposed, he's a Swiss national, it was not proposed by the government of Switzerland. The government of Switzerland quite politely sat on its hands. He was proposed by the government of Cuba. And when you see his reports and his approach, it's not surprising. But here's the lesson that I want you to take away from this. His reporting was very critical of the food industry, and everybody knew that he was supported by the government of Cuba. But Switzerland and other Western countries did not raise this political issue. They did not say, we don't want this job to be held by somebody who has these leftist views. He's predictable in what he's going to say. they accept that the process allows for independent thinkers to express their views. Now, Switzerland had many relations with multinational corporations. He was highly critical of multinational corporations. They did not manipulate the process to prevent him from being appointed. In the case of Balakrishna Rajagopal, he is going to be very critical of many government policies and practices. The governments are not putting pressure, they're letting this happen. He will be able to collect this information on the impact of the responses to COVID-19 on housing issues. And he'll be critical where he believes that the criticism is necessary. So these are all matters that if you discuss them in the abstract, back in the early days of the United Nations, saying what procedures will the United Nations develop to promote human rights, nobody would have imagined it would have been anything like this, that there would be a Balakrishnan Rajagopal, or more extreme examples, I gave you of Philip Alston, telling the United Nations that it's criminally responsible for cholera in Haiti, or that the World Bank is a human rights-free zone. Nobody expected that to happen, but it's accepted because these reports, in most instances, almost all instances, are very well documented and very thoughtfully analytical. And I think Balakrishnan Rajagopal's reports on the right to housing will be similarly honest and thorough.
Raj?
Yeah, thank you, Professor. There's a question with regards to the veto power that the permanent 5 in the Security Council possess. And do they also apply to the decisions of the Human Rights Council? And also your comments about the misuse and abuse of veto power.
The misuse and abuse of what power?
The veto powers.
Veto. Yeah. Well, we discussed this yesterday a little bit because our topic is not the Security Council, but in the reading that you had for yesterday, I did discuss the Security Council and the role of human rights in peace operations. The Human Rights Council, the UN General Assembly, the Economic and Social Council, the principal institutions of the UN that implement Articles 55 and 56 that are responsible for the promotion and protection of human rights through the United Nations operate on a majority voting process. So yes, there are political manipulations that take place. There are some issues on which a political divide is predictable and takes place. Let's take an example that we haven't discussed at all. The right to development is a human right. There is a draft convention on the right to development. There are resolutions adopted every year on the right to development. The breakdown of those resolutions is a tragic example of the politicization of a human rights issue. All countries from the non-aligned movement, from the G77, whatever you want to call it, the Global South, vote in favor. All Western countries with many Latin American friends vote against it. That's not very helpful. But these resolutions are adopted because they function on the majority rule in the Council and in the General Assembly of the United Nations. Chapter 7 of the UN Charter is a different matter. Chapter 7 is on peace and security and the role of the United Nations in taking action when threats to international peace and security occur, and for a decision to be taken under Article 7, as you know, it requires a majority vote of the Security Council, including all 5 permanent members of the Security Council. And yes, it is highly politicized, and yes, the right, the responsibility to protect that we talked about yesterday has failed because in critical situations, if we just take the example of Syria, Syria being supported by Russia, and I don't want to just gang up on Russia, you can find other situations in which the United States will be the culprit, but in this case, clearly, there is no hope for a decision on Syria, given the veto of Russia. Similarly, there is no hope for now, even though there have been some signs that it might change, that the situation in Jammu and Kashmir will be examined by the Security Council. India, of course, says it's an internal matter, and China is very sensitive to that issue, and China will support India in the Security Council. So human rights violations that rise to the level of threats to international peace and security, and that constitute massive violations of human rights that deserve the attention of the Security Council, will be subject to the politics of the Council, meaning that if there is a country that is identified as being the potential culprit, whether it is India or Syria or whatever country, if it has allies who are permanent members of the Security Council, politics will take over, and we will find ourselves on that balance that I was alluding to again between sovereignty on the one hand and international concern on the other. Sovereignty will win. This is not, how shall I say, a permanent feature. There have been in the past cases in which the Security Council has taken decisive action, and this can happen in the future. It is not happening in Syria, it is not happening in Kashmir, it is not happening with respect to gross violations of human rights by the United States, and so on. So yes, the failure of the Security Council of the United Nations, the functioning of the P5, reflects a fundamental defect of the UN. Understandable that at the end of World War II, the victorious powers would place the most important role of the UN in deciding on the use of force under their control with the veto power. The international community has radically changed since then, and the composition of the Security Council does not reflect the politics of the world today. On the other hand, the permanent members are not about to give up their authorities. So yes, that is one of the weak spots of human rights in the UN system. Any more questions?
Yeah. Thank you, Professor. There's one question with regards to the Indian context. Has there been any action taken by the UN or the Human Rights Mechanism regarding the Citizenship Amendment Act?
Oh, good question. There was, as I recall, and I think, Henry, I'm going to have to ask you to help me out on this. As I recall, there was an expression of concern by the High Commissioner that came out, but I don't recall whether the UN human rights procedures have been engaged in any other way. Do you have the background on that, Henry? I think you're muted.
The High Commissioner immediately came out on this in early December. I'm just, Raj, you can get access?
Yeah, I have
the
it.
Statement? You have it. You are faster than me, that's why I relied on you.
Yeah, that's what I recall. There was a very rapid statement. You recall that I showed you the picture yesterday.
Show it?
You're going to show it? Go ahead, Raj.
Raj will show it.
Okay.
And as Raj is showing it, and in addition to that, we have had an attempt by the Office of the High Commissioner to intervene in a pending case before the Supreme Court. as an amicus, but that has not been filed. I hope my information is correct. They've not yet filed it.
Oh, yes, I remember that as well. Yes.
Controversy over that.
Yeah, yeah.
And the UN Special Rapporteur on racism intervened in the Supreme Court in the first bench in a matter relating to Rohingyas, the first time it has ever happened, and the intervention was accepted, and the matter is pending. So these are all new developments taking place on the domestic field.
Yeah.
So here is Raj. Here is what Raj has put out. 13th December, the High Commissioner for Human Rights issued a press statement saying, "We are concerned that India's new Citizenship Amendment Act is fundamentally discriminatory in nature. The amended legislation seeks to expedite citizenship for religious minorities, naming specifically only Hindus, Sikhs, Buddhists, Jains, Parsis, and Christians fleeing persecution in Afghanistan, Bangladesh, and Pakistan who have been resident before 2014. But it does not extend the same protection to Muslims, including minority sections." And you go on. The statement is all that. I don't want to. We'll give access to all these today to you, and you will be able to read them in person. Should we close, Raj?
Yeah, time's up.
Professor, shall we? Any closing words from you?
Oh, closing words from me. Well, time is up. I hope that I have been able to share with you not only my efforts to understand these issues by studying them, but also as a result of some personal experience in the UN system. It's real. It has evolved. And I think, yes, I would like to make a substantive conclusion relating to these questions and what we have brought out. It does come back always to, I think, this balancing act between state sovereignty and international concern. And we've seen that in very unexpected ways, the procedures that we have been examining of the treaty bodies and the special procedure, the Universal Periodic Review, go well beyond anything that was expected at the time that human rights, in the language of one great professor of international human rights law, were enthroned into the Charter of the United Nations. Way beyond those expectations. But when it comes to the use of force and the sanctions powers of the Security Council, the functioning of Chapter 7 has stumbled. I'm not saying it's unsuccessful, because there have been many peace operations that have been adopted by the Security Council and that have been led to significant human rights progress thanks to the presence of the UN, and I've been part of that in at least 2 peacekeeping operations. So I know that it can make a difference on the ground. So the Security Council is not all bad, but the Security Council still reflects the power of the concept of state sovereignty and non-interference in the domestic affairs of states that constitutes an obstacle to the effective utilization of human rights mechanisms. That should not blind us from the fact of what we have been studying in this module of where the UN has evolved procedures that do have an impact, that do take input from civil society, that are taken seriously by governments, that do tell truth to power. So it is a mixed story, but one that I think has moved in the right direction, and the young people participating in this course will be in a position to move it to the next positive stage in the future. And I thank you for the privilege of having been part of this process.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor. I don't think we can all, participants and myself, thank you enough for these 2 very precious sessions. Friends, we cannot have access to such experts usually in civil society. But here was a university which was willing to immediately, its vice chancellor immediately mentioning to me that professor was on campus and said, Henry, you should invite professor, and professor immediately agreed. And he not only agreed for one session, he said, I'm willing to do the second. And I'm so grateful to you, so very grateful to you that you did it. Because I think this was a different posturing that our participants gave. Many lecturers yesterday have given us feedbacks that a very complicated UN has been presented to them in a very simple way, is what some feedback that reached my ears last night. So I really want to thank you, Professor, personally, on behalf of all of us in the organizing team, but on behalf of every single 193 participants and facilitators present here. Thank you warmly for having done this. And we have moved today in seeing that these people are really independent experts. And spontaneously, we were exposed to several recent statements, interventions, reports, call for reports, etc., from these individuals, which happened so spontaneously that the participants were able to see. And therefore, let me thank you. And also, please convey our gratitude to Raj. I was not able to thank him before he left. He had to leave for a meeting, as he always is, and therefore, please thank him. I want to assure the participants. You must have seen the names of the 23 experts who were invited to the public inquest or the people's inquest in Tuticorin. I'm happy to say at least 6 of those experts were resource persons for you. And another person who was there was also Shiv Viswanathan, which I wanted to tell Professor Steve Marks. Shiv was with us in a people's inquest 2 years ago, the commemoration of which we did on the 22nd of May 2018 for the killing of 16 persons by the state, and where we don't have a remedy till today. Yes. Friends, so therefore we will close the morning session. This afternoon we will be moving into what was shown yesterday in one slide, the Sustainable Development Goals. I know it was shown in some slide, I saw it coming, Sustainable Development Goals. The Sustainable Development Goals alone will be coming to the 17 goals. Please read up the goals alone before the session. They'll be sent to you. Please read up the goals, the 17 goals. We have Amita Beher from Oxfam, India, the Chief Executive Officer, who will be with us this afternoon, who has done a lot of work in this country with the SDGs, along with others and along with civil society. And we will be having, you will have an activity, very simple activity of going into certain websites and the Office of the High Commission, etc. But please go ahead. I see improvement in the participation in the groups in the evening, but that has to improve. I want the facilitators to ensure that they have provided the absentees of yesterday evening, and please keep track, because this is a discipline that we need to follow. We want you for 15 minutes only, but that 15 minutes is serious. Thank you very much, and thank you all for coming on time. And I also am happy I'm finishing not too late. Thank you very much, Professor. Thank you very much. Running back